Welcome back. We're on to Romans chapter 6, verses 15 to 23, slaves to righteousness. Chapter 6, verse 15, refined question. Verse 15 says, "What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? By no means." This question looks similar to the question that we've seen in verse 1. The text says, "What then?" Verse 1 challenges this crude understanding about sin and this misinterpretation that people could arrive at, that because God is full of grace, we can live any way that we want because God is just going to forgive us anyways. That's a crude misunderstanding that Paul begins to challenge again here. Here's the question that's really being asked. Because sin is no longer our master, can we indulge without fear of being controlled by it? The text says, "Shall we sin because?" Paul is guarding against this wrong assumption that could be made that we can sin anyways and not be affected by it. And he says, that's really the question you're asking. Can you not be affected by the sin that you do? Here's the answer. We have the freedom not to sin. The text says, by no means. An attitude that welcomes sin, rationalizes it, accepts it, embraces it, that's not grace. That's not living in grace. That's actually living in slavery to sin. Chapter 6, verse 16, definitely slaves. Verse 16 says, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness." Let's look at a definition for the word slave. A slave was a person owned as property by another. It also refers to the relationship that bound the owner and the slave. Slavery was widespread in the ancient Near East. By Roman times, slavery was very commonplace. In the early Christian period, 1 out of every 2 people was a slave. From at least 3000 BC, captives in war were the primary source of slaves. In Roman times, when the number of slaves increased dramatically, household slaves remained the best treated. Many became servants and close friends. Some even established good businesses to their own and their master's benefit. Paul's point here is that we are slaves to whomever it is that we obey. The text says, when you offer yourselves to someone to obey. Now remember, Paul isn't speaking for slavery here. What he's doing is he's drawing an illustration from what's normal for him. 1 out of every 2 people were slaves back in Paul's day, roughly. That's a ton of people. At least 1 in every 2 people were slaves. It probably could have been a little bit more than that. So Paul is drawing from an illustration on his present day. He's not saying that slavery is good. He's saying, listen, we are slaves to whoever it is that we obey. There are only 2 masters available to choose from. The text says, whether you are servants to sin or to obedience. There is no middle ground. You can't sit on the fence when it comes to your relationship with God because there is no fence. You are either living for God or you are not living for God. You are either living in obedience to the call of faith, to that relationship with God, or you are saying, no, thank you, I'm going to live according to sin. I'm going to live in a way that says, no, thank you, I don't want the relationship. Here's the offer. This is what it all hinges on. God says, I want to be your friend. We say yes or no. If we say yes, and we're going to be living in a way that's going to be promoting that friendship. If we say no, or even if we subconsciously say no, if we verbally say yes, but with our actions we say no, we're going to be living in a way that's breaking that relationship. So there's no fence. There's no middle ground here. We're either choosing to live for God or we're choosing to move away from God. Chapter 6, verse 17, obediently free. Verse 17 says, but thanks be to God that, though you used to be slaves to sin, you wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. Let's look at a definition of form of teaching. This is probably the basic doctrines of the gospel and its implications for life which new converts received. This teaching probably included ethical instruction. Obedience to the gospel leads to freedom from sin. The text says, wholeheartedly obeyed. Before we came to Jesus, we were slaves to sin. Before we came to Jesus, we were looking at ourselves and saying, I'm going to do whatever pleases me. And we weren't saying, I don't care about God. He just wasn't on our to-do list. We're moving away from him, and a lot of us don't even realize what we're doing. Once we have come to Jesus, it's that obeying the call to faith, obeying the call to move into relationship with God. That is actually what's freeing us. As you and I continue to apply ourselves to move closer in relationship with God, we stop doing the things that break God's heart, and we start doing the things that really please God. And all that stuff we're doing to please God, all that stuff we're doing to bring ourselves in a closer relationship, all that's going to be rewarded. All of that is beneficial. Chapter 6, verse 18, there can be only one. Verse 18 says, you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. Every person has a master. It's either sin or it's righteousness. The text says, set free, have become slaves. Now we saw this in the verse before, that we can only serve one master. We're either serving God or we're serving not God, something else. We're serving sin that pulls us away from God. When you and I have chosen to place our faith in Jesus, you and I, according to the illustration that Paul is using here, we become slaves to righteousness because we have submitted ourselves to work within a relationship, to live within a relationship with God. And as long as we've submitted ourselves to live within that relationship, then we are slaves to that kind of obedience. We are slaves to following God. And therefore, the choice to say, I'm going to break God's heart and I'm going to live another way, that choice has been taken away from us, because the choice that we have made is, I'm going to follow God, which means we're not going to choose to follow something that's going to break God's heart. Chapter 6, verse 19, why slaves? Verse 19 says, I put this in human terms, because you are weak in your natural selves. Just as you used to offer the parts of your body in slavery to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer them in slavery to righteousness, leading to holiness. Let's look at a definition for human terms. Paul explains why he uses the imperfect human analogy of slavery to describe our relationship to God. And for some people, it's offensive, and so Paul is explaining why he's using it here. In some ways, it is wholly inappropriate, but in other ways, it expresses important truths. Let's talk about Paul's illustration. Everyone knew what slavery was. The text says, in human terms. Let's talk about Paul's day. In Paul's day, this use of slavery as an illustration was highly applicable, since at least half of the people around were slaves. So people get it. People know that he's not saying everybody needs to be a slave. People know that he's not saying that God favors slavery, because God doesn't favor slavery. It's for freedom that you've been set free, is what Paul says, I think, in the book of Galatians. He doesn't favor slavery. However, since half of the people, since half of his contemporaries are slaves, this is an illustration that really makes sense to the people that he's writing to. Being a slave to righteousness is much better than being a slave to sin. The text says, offer them in slavery to righteousness, leading to holiness. Becoming a slave to righteousness isn't really as bad as it sounds. Becoming a slave to righteousness means that we look more and more like Jesus every day, and it still makes sense. You and I are held captive by the choices that we make. If I have chosen to do something, then I have submitted myself to that choice, and I'm in slavery of the choice that I have made. This is just following Paul's illustration here. I have chosen to be in relationship with God, therefore I'm holding myself captive to that choice to continue to move in the direction that God wants me to go. Chapter 6, verse 20 to 21, shameful freedom. Verse 20 to 21 says, when you were slaves to sin, you were free from the control of righteousness. What benefit did you reap at that time from the things you are now ashamed of? Those things result in death. Being free of righteousness is the opposite of freedom. The text says, free from the control of righteousness. Classifying freedom to sin as though it was the freedom of the obligation of righteousness is a huge distortion. It's got things backward. Freedom to sin is not free of being called to righteousness. Freedom to sin only leads to death. It is appropriate to feel ashamed of our pre-Christian actions. The text says, the things you are now ashamed of. One of the best testimonies that I like to hear in church is from people who would say, I grew up in the church and I may have fallen away once or twice or backslidden once or twice, but I have to be honest. I love hearing these testimonies. I have to be honest that I have served Jesus my entire life. I love those testimonies. There are other testimonies that we hear on Sunday where people will come and they'll say that they'll list all their baggage and all their laundry items. Say, I used to be this, I used to be that. And, those are wonderful too. But we feel ashamed about all that stuff. And sometimes we can't even mention some things on the microphone saying, this is what I used to do, that's what I used to do, because we feel ashamed of all that stuff. It's appropriate to feel ashamed of all the stuff in the past that broke the heart of God and that really only worked to move us away from God. I have a request, please. Would you please share the love? Because it really helps. Get the news out that these teaching videos are here, that we're exploring Romans together in Christianity 101. Share it on Facebook, pin it, like it on YouTube. That'd just be awesome. Thanks in advance for sharing that. Just go ahead and share it with all your friends. That's awesome. And then the second request is, would you please leave a comment? Inductively, I invite you to answer one of these three questions. What did you hear? What does it mean? What are you going to do about it? What did you hear? Is God speaking to you right out of the text and you heard something for God? We'll write that down. What does it mean? You've got to interpret that. This is what I think that means, the stuff that God has told me. Then thirdly, now I absolutely have to do something about this. This is the application that I've come up with. God bless you. I'll see you next time.